They told me to tear it down, so I did. The sound wasn't loud at first, just a dull shift under my boots, like the ground exhaling after holding its breath too long. Then came the low groan, deep, heavy, like something ancient finally giving up. I remember the smell most. Wet earth, clay and groundwater, thick in the air like a storm had just cracked open underground. I stood there, hands in my jacket pockets, watching the space where my retaining wall used to be, and I didn't say a word, because I already knew what was coming next. 3 days earlier, the air smelled like fresh-cut grass and overpriced perfume. Victoria Hale stepped onto my property like she owned it, heels clicking against my gravel driveway with that sharp, confident rhythm HOA presidents seemed to perfect. She didn't knock. Didn't need to. People like her never think doors apply to them. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, holding a clipboard like it was a badge. "This structure is non-compliant." I followed her gaze to the retaining wall, 6 feet tall, reinforced concrete, weathered just enough to blend into the hillside. My father built that wall 32 years ago with his own hands. Every inch of it measured twice, poured once. It wasn't decorative. It wasn't optional. It was the only thing standing between my backyard and the slope behind it, a slope that didn't just sit there quietly like it looked. "It's been here longer than your HOA," I told her. Calm. Level. The way my dad taught me when dealing with people who mistake authority for intelligence. She smiled. Not warm. Not friendly. The kind of smile that feels like paperwork. "That may be," she said, flipping a page, "but it doesn't meet current aesthetic guidelines. You have 14 days to remove it." 14 days. I could feel the number sitting in the air between us like a loaded clock. I didn't argue. Not then. I just nodded and watched her walk back to that white SUV of hers, the one that always smelled like leather and control. The moment she left, I walked straight to the wall, ran my hand along the surface, felt the cool concrete under my palm. Solid. Steady. But I noticed something most people wouldn't. A faint dampness near the base. Not new. Not sudden. Just there. Like it had always been waiting. That night, I dug through my father's old files in the garage. Blueprints. Permits. Notes scribbled in pencil that had faded but never disappeared. He didn't build things halfway. Ever. And when I found the original plans, I felt it. That quiet shift in my chest. The same feeling I used to get when he'd say, "Pay attention, Ethan. Some things look simple until they're not." The wall wasn't just holding back dirt. It was holding pressure. Water flow. Soil weight calculated down to the inch. It was a system, and removing it didn't break the system. It released it. The next morning, I read the notice again. Every word. Every line. Legal language wrapped around a simple demand. Tear it down. So I did exactly what they asked. No shortcuts. No damage. I hired a licensed crew. Filed the proper paperwork. Sent confirmation emails to the HOA office with timestamps and signatures. If they wanted it gone, it was going to be gone by the book. Victoria even showed up the day we started. Sunglasses on. Arms crossed. Watching like she was overseeing a victory. "Glad to see you're cooperating," she said. I didn't answer. I just looked past her, up the hill at the line where the soil met the sky. The crew worked methodically, section by section. Concrete cracking under controlled pressure. Rebar exposed like the bones of something that had been standing guard for decades. And then, just before the final segment came down, everything went quiet. No wind. No birds. Just that smell again. Wet earth. Stronger this time. Heavier. I stepped back. Slow. Careful. Because I knew. And what she didn't realize was that wall wasn't protecting my property. It was protecting hers. The first crack sounded like someone snapping a thick branch under tension, sharp and clean, but it did not echo the way I expected. It sank into the ground instead, absorbed by something beneath the surface that had been waiting longer than anyone standing there could understand. The crew froze for half a second, tools hanging midair, boots shifting in the gravel like they suddenly were not sure where to stand. I did not move. I kept my eyes on the slope above us, watching the line where the soil darkened just slightly, almost like a shadow creeping forward 1 inch at a time. One of the workers wiped his hands on his jeans and glanced at me. "You want us to keep going?" he asked, voice low, cautious. I nodded once. "Finish it." My voice came out steady, but I could feel the air changing, heavier now, thicker with moisture. That damp smell was no longer subtle. It was rising. Victoria stepped closer, heels crunching against broken concrete. Her sunglasses reflecting the half-demolished wall, like she was watching a home renovation show instead of standing in the middle of something she did not understand. "Is there going to be a mess?" she asked, not looking at me, just scanning the site with mild irritation. "We just had the landscaping redone last month." I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was so perfectly misplaced. "There might be," I said. That was all I gave her. No explanation. No warning she would actually hear. The final section came down slower than the rest. The crew used a controlled brake, easing the last slab forward until gravity took over. It hit the ground with a dull, heavy thud that sent a vibration up through my boots and into my chest. Then everything stopped. Completely. No wind. No insects. Just silence, so clean it felt unnatural. I heard a faint trickle at first. Not from above. From behind where the wall had been. A thin line of water slipped through the exposed soil, clear and steady, like a leak that had just been given permission to exist. One of the guys pointed. "Hey, you seeing that?" Another stream followed. Then another. The ground began to darken in patches, spreading outward in uneven shapes. The soil that had looked solid minutes ago started to soften, edges losing their definition as water pushed its way through channels that had been sealed for decades. I took a step back. Then another. Not rushed. Just deliberate. Victoria noticed that. "Why are you backing up?" she asked, a slight edge creeping into her voice now. I did not answer her directly. I just looked at the slope again. The angle. The weight. The way the top layer shifted. Just enough to tell the truth if you knew how to read it. "Because it is about to move," I said quietly. She laughed once, short and dismissive. "It is dirt, Mr. Caldwell. Dirt does not just move." I let that sit for a second. It does when it is holding water. The first real shift was subtle. A low sliding sound, like something heavy adjusting itself into a more comfortable position. The ground did not collapse. It eased. A slow, creeping motion that carried more weight than any sudden break ever could. Water pushed through faster now, no longer thin lines, but small streams, weaving together, feeding into each other. The soil above them started to sag, not falling, just settling forward inch by inch, like a breath being released after years of pressure. The crew backed off instinctively, boots scraping as they cleared space. No one shouted. No one panicked. It was too controlled for that. Too inevitable. Victoria took a step back, then another, her posture tightening as she finally stopped looking at the wall and started looking at the hill behind it. The realization did not hit her all at once. It came in pieces. The water. The movement. The way the ground no longer looked stable. "What did you do?" she asked, voice thinner now. I met her eyes for the first time since the demolition started. "Exactly what you told me to do." Behind us, the slope shifted again, a little faster this time, and the sound that followed was not a crack or a break but a deep, steady slide, like the land itself had decided it was done holding still. The ground did not rush. That was the part most people never understand. It was not a dramatic collapse or some sudden disaster you see on television. It was slow, deliberate, like the earth was thinking through every inch before it moved. The slope eased forward another few inches, and the sound deepened into something steady and continuous, like gravel being poured out of a truck bed in slow motion. Water kept pushing through, clearer now, stronger, carving thin paths through soil that had not seen open air in decades. I could see layers in the hillside that had been hidden behind that wall my father built, compacted earth, clay bands. Pockets of darker soil saturated enough to glisten under the light. Each one had been held in place by pressure, balance, and time. And now all three were shifting. Victoria's sunglasses came off. She held them in her hand, like she suddenly needed to see this without any filter. Her posture changed too. The confidence was still there, but it had cracks in it now. The kind you only notice when something underneath starts to move. "Make it stop," she said, quick, sharp, like this was a contractor issue, something you could fix with a phone call and a complaint. I shook my head once. It does not work like that. The crew had already moved back toward the driveway, tools set aside, eyes fixed on the slope. Nobody wanted to be closer than necessary. Not because it was dangerous in that immediate sense, but because there is a point where you recognize something bigger than your control, and you give it space. The water flow increased again, no longer small streams, but a steady release, like a valve that had been opened after years of holding pressure. The soil above it began to lose its structure in visible ways now, edges softening, clumps separating, sliding over each other instead of holding firm. It moved maybe a foot forward in total, not fast, but enough to change everything about how that hill behaved. I could hear it now more clearly, a low, constant shifting, like layers rearranging themselves into a new reality. Victoria turned toward me, her voice tighter than before. You knew this would happen. I did not look away from the slope. I knew what the wall was doing. That was the difference. I did not cause anything. I removed the one thing that had been quietly managing the problem. There is a difference between creating damage and allowing reality to show itself. She took a step closer to me, gravel crunching hard under her heel this time. You should have said something. I let that hang in the air for a second. The smell of wet clay was strong now, mixed with something metallic from the exposed soil layers. You did not ask, I said. Behind us, the hillside shifted again, another slow release, more soil settling forward, water continuing to push through. In steady lines. It was not stopping. Not quickly. And that was the part that mattered. This was not a single moment. It was a process. A chain reaction set in motion the second that wall came down. I pulled my phone out and checked the time. Then I opened the email thread. The one with her official notice. The one where I had replied, clearly, directly, confirming that I would comply with the removal request as instructed by the Homeowners Association. Everything documented. Everything timestamped. Every step exactly as required. I had even included the contractor's license number and the scheduled demolition window. I scrolled through it slowly, not because I needed to read it again, but because I understood what it meant now in a way she did not yet fully grasp. This was not about a wall anymore. This was about responsibility. The slope continued to settle, inch by inch, reshaping itself, sending more water downhill toward the properties below. Not violently, not suddenly, just enough to change drainage paths, to soften ground that had been considered stable, to remind everyone that land is not static just because you want it to be. Victoria followed my gaze downhill for the first time, really looking now, not at my property, but at everything beyond it. The landscaped yards, the manicured lawns, the neat lines of fencing and decorative stone that assumed the ground beneath them would always stay exactly where it was. I could see it in her face when it finally connected. Not panic. Not yet. Just the beginning of understanding. That is going to affect the lower lots, she said quietly. I nodded. It already is. The wind picked up slightly then, carrying the scent of wet earth farther down the slope, and the low, steady sound of shifting ground continued, patient and unstoppable, like it had all the time in the world to prove its point. The sound carried farther now. Not louder, just wider, like it had found new space to exist in. You could hear it rolling down the slope, slipping under fences, brushing against the edges of patios and stone walkways that had been placed there under the assumption that the ground beneath them would always stay put. It never does. It just waits. I walked a few steps toward the edge of my property line, boots pressing into soil that was already softer than it had been an hour ago. The difference was subtle unless you knew what to feel for. A slight give, a quiet shift under pressure. The kind of thing my father used to point out when I was a kid, kneeling beside him with a tape measure in one hand and a level in the other. Ground tells you everything, he would say. You just have to listen before it speaks too loud. Behind me, Victoria was already on her phone. Her voice had changed. Faster now. Less controlled. I need someone from the city out here, she said, pacing in tight circles on the gravel. There is erosion happening, and it is moving toward the lower properties. She paused, listening, then glanced at me like I had somehow rewritten the laws of physics just to inconvenience her landscaping schedule. Yes, immediately, she added. I could hear the faint echo of a voice through the speaker, calm, procedural, asking questions that required answers she did not have. How long had the condition existed? What recent changes had been made? Whether any structural elements had been altered? She hesitated on that last one, just for a second. Then she looked straight at me. I held her gaze without saying a word. She turned away and answered carefully, choosing language the way people do when they are trying to shape responsibility before it lands on them. A retaining structure was removed this morning, she said. That was accurate, technically, but accuracy is not the same as truth. The slope shifted again, another few inches forward, sending a thin ribbon of water down along the side yard of the house below mine. I could see it from where I stood, the way the ground darkened in a narrow path, the way it curved naturally toward the lowest point, following gravity like it always does. Landscaping stones that had been perfectly aligned started to tilt slightly, not falling, just adjusting. It was enough. Enough to show what was coming if nothing stopped it. A man stepped out onto the back patio of the lower house, coffee mug in hand. Still in a t-shirt like this was just another quiet morning. He looked down at the ground near his fence, then up toward the hill, trying to connect something that did not make sense yet. I recognized that look. Confusion first, then calculation, then concern. He set the mug down on the railing and walked closer to the fence line, crouching slightly to touch the soil. When he stood back up, he looked directly at me. Not angry. Not yet. Just waiting for an explanation that matched what he was seeing. I gave him a small nod. Not reassurance. Just acknowledgement. Victoria ended the call and walked over, her heels less steady now on the uneven gravel. They are sending someone, she said, like that alone could slow down what was already in motion. I nodded once. They should. The air felt different now. Cooler. Damp. The kind of air you get after heavy rain. Except the sky above us was clear. All of this was coming from the ground itself, released from a system that had been quietly managing it for decades. She crossed her arms, then uncrossed them, then looked down the slope again. This is going to cost a lot to fix, she said, almost to herself. I did not respond right away. Instead, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The original permit copy. County stamped. Dated. Signed. It outlined the retaining wall as a structural necessity for slope stabilization and subsurface water control. I had shown it to her once. She had dismissed it as outdated. I held it out now, not forcing it into her hand, just offering it into the space between us. She hesitated, then took it, eyes scanning the page, moving faster at first, then slowing as the language settled in. Engineering terms have a way of cutting through opinion. Load distribution, hydrostatic pressure, drainage mitigation, words that do not care about aesthetics or committee votes. The slope shifted again behind us, steady and patient, and the sound of moving earth continued like a quiet reminder that this was not a negotiation. Victoria lowered the paper slightly, her expression tightening in a way that had nothing to do with control anymore. You knew exactly what this wall was doing, she said. I nodded. So did the county. She looked back at the hillside, then down toward the homes below, then back at the document in her hands. For the first time since she stepped onto my property, she did not look like someone in charge. She looked like someone reading the consequences of a decision that had already been made. The sirens did not rush in. They rolled in slow, controlled, like everything else that day. A white county truck pulled up first, tires crunching over gravel, followed by a second vehicle with a city engineering seal on the door. Two men stepped out, both in work boots, both carrying that quiet, focused posture of people who deal in facts instead of opinions. One of them took a deep breath as soon as he stepped onto the property, like he could read the air the same way I could. Wet soil. Groundwater. Pressure released. He did not need anyone to explain it to him. He could already see it. Victoria walked toward them quickly, her voice snapping back into something closer to authority. Thank you for coming out so fast, she said, gesturing toward the slope like she was presenting a problem she had just discovered. We are dealing with active erosion affecting multiple properties. The older of the two engineers nodded once, eyes scanning the hillside, then the exposed cut where the wall had been. He did not interrupt her. He just listened while taking in everything that actually mattered. The angle, the soil condition, the water flow. When she finished, he turned to me. You the property owner? I nodded. Yes, sir. He glanced at the exposed ground again, then back at me. Was there a retaining structure here before today? There was. I kept it simple. Clean. The way facts are supposed to be. He nodded again, then looked at Victoria. And it was removed? She stepped in quickly. Yes, it was non-compliant with HOA standards and needed to be taken down. He paused for just a second. Not long, but enough to shift the tone of the entire conversation. HOA standards, he repeated, slower this time, like he was placing the words where they belonged. Then he crouched near the exposed soil, pressing his fingers lightly into the damp ground, watching how it responded. He did not rush. He let the ground tell him the story. You got subsurface water here, he said, mostly to himself. And this soil is losing cohesion. He stood back up and walked a few steps along the slope, following the path of the water as it moved downhill. The second engineer was already taking notes, snapping photos, documenting everything with quiet efficiency. Victoria crossed her arms again, but this time it looked more like she was holding herself in place than asserting control. Can this be stabilized? She asked. The older engineer looked at her, then back at the slope. It was stabilized, he said. That landed differently than anything else that had been said so far. No accusation, no emotion, just a fact placed exactly where it belonged. He turned back to me. Do you have any original permits or design documentation for the structure that was here? I reached into my jacket and handed him the folded copy I had shown Victoria earlier. He opened it carefully, scanning the page, then flipping it over to check the county stamp. His eyebrows lifted slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition. This was engineered for load and hydrostatic control, he said, tapping the paper lightly. This was not decorative. I did not say anything. I did not need to. He already understood. Victoria stepped closer, her voice sharper now. That may be, but it did not meet community guidelines. The engineer looked at her for a moment, then back at the slope, then down at the paper again. When he spoke, his tone did not change, but the meaning did. Community guidelines do not override structural necessity. The words settled into the space between us like weight finding its place. Behind us, the hillside shifted again, another slow movement, more water threading its way through the soil, continuing the process that had already begun. The second engineer approached, holding up a tablet. We are seeing movement extending about 15 feet downslope so far, he said. And the water flow is increasing. The older engineer nodded, then looked at Victoria again. We are going to need to assess impact on the lower properties and determine immediate mitigation. She opened her mouth like she was about to respond, then stopped. For the first time, she did not have a counter. No rule to quote. No authority to lean on. Just a situation that did not care about any of that. I stepped back slightly, giving them space, watching as they moved through the site with purpose, measuring, documenting, understanding. The slope continued its slow, steady shift, not dramatic, not violent, just persistent. The kind of movement that does not stop because someone decides it should. Victoria stood there holding that permit in her hand, eyes moving between the paper, the hillside, and the homes below. And in that moment, the structure she had forced me to remove was gone. But the structure she had trusted, the idea that she could control everything with a rulebook, was starting to give way just as quietly. The clipboard came out next. Not Victoria's. The engineer's. He flipped it open with a practiced motion, pen already in hand, eyes still scanning the slope like he was reading something written beneath the surface. We need to establish sequence, he said, calm and steady. What existed, what changed, and who authorized it. That word sat there for a second. Authorized. It did not belong to opinions or preferences. It belonged to responsibility. Victoria shifted her weight, the gravel crunched sharper now under her heel. The Homeowners Association issued a compliance notice, she said, lifting her chin slightly, trying to bring that authority back into the room. The structure was removed accordingly. The engineer wrote something down, then looked up at her. Do you have that notice? She hesitated just long enough to be noticed, then pulled out her phone, scrolling quickly. Her fingers moved faster than her confidence. Yes, I can pull it up, she said, turning the screen toward him. He stepped closer, reading silently. I watched his eyes move line by line, not reacting, just processing. When he finished, he nodded once and handed the phone back. Then he looked at me. Do you have your response? I already had it open. I handed him my phone, the email thread clear, time-stamped, attachments included. He read through it carefully, pausing at the part where I confirmed full compliance with the directive, including licensed removal and scheduled execution. When he finished, he gave a small exhale through his nose, the kind people do when the pieces line up exactly the way they expected. All right, he said, more to the situation than to either of us. Behind him, the slope continued its slow movement, another inch forward, more water finding its way down, widening the path it had started. The lower yard now had visible saturation, patches of grass darkening unevenly, the clean lines of landscaping starting to blur. The homeowner below stepped out farther this time. No coffee in his hand now, just both arms slightly out like he was trying to balance understanding with concern. "What is going on up there?" he called out. The engineer turned slightly, raising a hand in acknowledgement. "We are assessing it now, sir," he said. "We will give you guidance shortly." Then he turned back to us. "Here is where we are," he said, voice even clear. That retaining wall was part of a structural system designed to manage both soil load and subsurface water. Removing it without a replacement system in place has allowed pressure to release and soil to lose stability. Victoria opened her mouth, but he continued before she could redirect it. "The key question now is who required that removal. Silence does not always come from confusion. Sometimes it comes from clarity arriving all at once." The air felt heavier again, damp and still, carrying that steady scent of exposed earth. Victoria looked down at the phone in her hand, then at the paper permit, then at the slope, like she was trying to find a version of this that still worked in her favor. There was not one. "The HOA issued the notice," she said finally, quieter this time. The engineer nodded slowly. "Then we will need to document that." He wrote again, deliberate, precise. Every word placed where it could not be moved later. I stepped back another pace, giving them room, feeling the ground shift subtly under my boots as the process continued. Not faster, just steady. The kind of steady that does not stop because someone decides it should. The second engineer approached. Again, pointing toward the lower properties. "Water is now redirecting into adjacent lots," he said. "We are seeing early signs of soil displacement along the fence lines." The older engineer nodded. "We will need temporary mitigation as soon as possible," he said. Then he looked at Victoria. "That is going to involve immediate coordination and likely cost." That word landed heavier than anything else so far. Cost. Not theoretical. Not aesthetic. Real. Measurable. Unavoidable. Victoria's shoulders dropped just slightly. Not enough for most people to notice, but enough. The kind of shift that happens when control slips just out of reach. "What are we talking about?" she asked. The engineer did not rush the answer. He looked at the slope again, at the water, at the spread of saturation, calculating. "At minimum," he said, "temporary drainage, soil stabilization, and engineering review for reconstruction of a proper retaining system." He paused, then added, "And that is just to stop further movement." The hillside gave another quiet shift behind him, reinforcing the point without needing to raise its voice. I stood there, hands relaxed at my sides, watching it all unfold exactly the way I knew it would. Not because I wanted it to, because that is how it works. You do not argue with gravity. You do not negotiate with water. And you do not remove a system designed to hold both back and expect nothing to follow. Victoria looked at me then, really looked this time, like she was seeing past the surface for the first time. "You knew this would cost us," she said. I met her gaze, calm, steady. I knew what the wall was doing. And behind us, the ground continued to move, patient and certain, like it had been waiting for someone to finally stop pretending it was not there. The wind shifted again, carrying the damp smell farther down the street, past trimmed hedges and perfectly edged lawns that suddenly looked less permanent than they had an hour ago. You could see it now if you knew where to look. Not damage, not destruction, just change. Subtle at first. A fence line leaning a fraction of an inch off true. A stone border no longer perfectly aligned. The kind of details most people ignore until they cannot. The engineer stepped closer to the slope again, boots sinking slightly into the softened ground, then turned back toward the lower properties, mapping the movement in his head like he had seen this exact pattern before. "We are going to need immediate temporary drainage," he said to his partner. "Sandbags, diversion channels, anything to redirect flow away from those foundations." The second engineer nodded, already typing into his tablet, likely triggering calls that would bring in crews who dealt with problems after they had already started. Victoria watched them, silent now, her phone still in her hand, but forgotten. The confidence she had walked in with was gone, replaced by something quieter. Not panic. Not yet. Just the realization that this was no longer a situation she could manage with notices and fines. This was outside her system. I took another step back, feeling the ground settle again under my boots, the movement steady and consistent, like a slow clock ticking down. The homeowner below was on his phone now too, pacing along his fence line, glancing up every few seconds, trying to track something that was not visible in one place, but everywhere at once. That is the thing about ground movement. It does not announce itself in one dramatic moment. It shows up in inches, in angles, in things that used to be straight and are not anymore. The engineer looked at Victoria again, not unkindly, but directly. We are going to document this as a structural destabilization event following removal of a retaining system, he said. That documentation will include the source of the directive. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The meaning was clear enough without volume. Victoria swallowed once, a small movement, but it carried weight. The Homeowners Association was acting within its authority, she said, but the words did not land the way she intended. Authority sounds different when it meets consequences. The engineer nodded slowly, acknowledging the statement without agreeing with it. That may be part of the record, he said, but so is engineering necessity. Behind him, the slope gave another quiet shift. More water threading through the soil, widening its path, finding the easiest way down. It always does. It does not care about lines on a map or rules in a binder. It follows the path that exists. I reached into my pocket again, not for anything new, just to feel the edge of the folded permit still there, a reminder of something that had been understood long before any of this started. My father did not build that wall because it looked good. He built it because the land required it. Because he listened before it spoke too loud. The second engineer walked back over, showing something on the tablet. We are getting reports from 2 properties downhill, he said. Water is pooling near foundation edges, and there is visible soil softening along at least one retaining border. The older engineer nodded once. That confirms spread, he said. Then he turned to Victoria again. We are going to recommend immediate emergency mitigation and a full engineering review. That review will determine long-term reconstruction requirements and responsibility allocation. That last part settled into the air like a final piece clicking into place. Responsibility allocation. Not opinion. Not preference. Measured. Assigned. Documented. Victoria looked at me again, but this time there was no challenge in it. No authority. Just calculation. Trying to understand how this had moved from a compliance issue to something much larger. You could have warned us, she said quietly. I held her gaze for a moment. I did, I said. You just did not recognize what you were looking at. The wind picked up slightly again, brushing across the slope, carrying the scent of wet earth and exposed layers farther into the neighborhood. The engineers moved with purpose now, marking points, making calls, setting in motion the next steps that would try to slow something already underway. And I stood there, just off to the side, watching it all unfold exactly the way it was always going to, not because anyone forced it to, but because once you remove the thing holding everything in place, the rest does not ask permission to follow. The neighborhood started to change its rhythm. Not loudly, not all at once, just enough that you could feel it if you stood still and paid attention. Doors opened. People stepped outside. Conversations began in low voices that carried farther than usual in the damp air. The kind of quiet tension that spreads faster than sound. The engineers had already marked off key points along the slope with bright flags, each one placed with purpose, each one telling a story most people could not read. I could. Every flag traced the path of pressure that had finally been released, mapping out what had been held back for decades without anyone noticing. A utility truck arrived next, then another, workers unloading sandbags and equipment with efficient movements that spoke of routine. This was not new to them. Situations like this happen when systems are removed without understanding what they were doing. The difference here was not the problem. It was how it started. I watched as they began placing barriers along the lower edge of my property, trying to redirect the water flow before it spread further. It helped, but only in the way a temporary solution always does. It slowed things down. It did not stop them. Victoria stood a few feet away, arms at her sides now, no longer crossed, no longer defensive. Just still, watching everything unfold in front of her in real time. The engineer approached her again, clipboard in hand, expression unchanged. We are going to need to issue a formal incident report, he said. That report will include cause, contributing factors, and responsible parties. He did not rush the words. He did not soften them either. She nodded once, but it was slow, like the meaning had to catch up to her first. And what does that mean exactly? She asked. He looked down at his notes, then back at her. It means this will move beyond field assessment, he said. County review. Potential liability. Required remediation under supervision. Each word landed heavier than the last. Behind him, the slope shifted again, smaller this time, but still there. Still moving. Still proving the same point. The homeowner below had moved farther along his yard, now standing near the corner where the soil was visibly darker, his shoes leaving slight impressions in the ground as he shifted his weight. He looked up again, not confused anymore. He understood enough now to know this was not something that would resolve on its own. "Is this going to get worse?" he called out. The engineer did not hesitate. "We are working to contain it," he said. Which was the truth. Not an answer, just the truth. I stepped closer to the edge again, watching the way the water had carved a clearer path now, a narrow channel forming where before there had been none. It was not aggressive. It was precise, following the easiest route, the way it always does when nothing is there to guide it otherwise. My father used to say water does not fight. It finds a way. Victoria took a step toward me, slower this time, like she was approaching something she did not fully trust. "How long was that wall there?" she asked. Her voice had lost the sharp edge it once carried. I did not look at her right away. I kept my eyes on the slope. "Over 30 years, I said. "Built before any of these houses were here." She nodded faintly, like she was placing that into a timeline that suddenly mattered more than anything in her rulebook. "And it was doing all of this the whole time?" I nodded once. Quietly. The word hung there for a second. Quietly. That was the part people miss. The things that matter most are usually the ones you do not notice because they are working exactly the way they are supposed to, until they are not. The engineer's radio crackled briefly, a short exchange confirming additional crews on the way, more equipment, more measures to slow what had already started. He clipped it back to his belt and looked over the site one more time, taking in the full picture. Then he wrote something final on his clipboard and closed it. That sound, the snap of it closing, felt more definitive than anything else so far. Not because it ended anything, because it recorded it. Victoria exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that comes when there is nothing left to control. She looked down at the permit still in her hand, then back at the slope, then finally at me. "I thought it was just a wall," she said. I met her eyes, calm, steady, the same way I had from the beginning. "It was," I said. Then I glanced back at the hillside, at the water, at the slow, steady movement that had not stopped since the moment it began. Just not the kind you could afford to lose. By late afternoon, the light had changed. Not because of the sun, but because of everything it was reflecting off of now. What soil does that? It darkens, deepens, pulls the color out of everything around it until the whole landscape feels heavier, more real. The crews were still working, moving with that steady urgency that never turns into panic, just focus. Sandbags lined the lower edges now, shallow channels carved to guide the water away from foundations, pumps set up to pull excess moisture from where it had begun to collect. It was working, in the way effort always does. Slowing things down, buying time. But the ground was still shifting. Less now. Smaller movements. Inches turning into fractions. The kind of change that most people would stop noticing if they were not told to keep watching. I stayed near the edge of my property, hands resting loosely at my sides, listening. The sound had softened, but it had not disappeared. A low, steady whisper of earth settling into a new balance. That is what it was now. Not collapse. Not failure. Adjustment. The engineer walked back up toward me, boots marked with damp clay, clipboard tucked under his arm. He stopped a few feet away, looking out over the slope one more time before speaking. "We are stabilizing the immediate flow," he said. "But this will require a full rebuild. Proper design. Permitting. Oversight." I nodded once. That part was not a surprise. He glanced at me, then back at the ground. "That wall held for a long time," he added. I followed his gaze. "It was built to." He gave a small nod, like that answer fit exactly where it belonged. Behind us, Victoria was speaking with someone on the phone again, but her tone had changed completely now. Slower. Measured. No sharp edges. No commands. Just information being relayed, questions being asked in a way that suggested she already knew the answers would not be simple. I could hear fragments of it carried by the breeze. Words like assessment, liability, emergency funds. Language that lives in a different world than enforcement notices and aesthetic violations. The homeowner below had moved back toward his house, standing near the patio, watching the crews work, watching the ground, watching the way his yard no longer behaved the way it had that morning. He was not angry. Not yet. He was doing what people do when something shifts under their sense of certainty. He was recalibrating. The engineer opened his clipboard again, flipping to the last page, scanning it one more time before making a final note. The pen moved slowly, deliberate, like each word mattered more than usual. Because it did. When he finished, he closed it again and looked at Victoria. "You will be contacted by the county within 24 hours, he said. "They will outline next steps, including required engineering review and cost allocation." She nodded, but this time there was no attempt to frame it differently. No effort to soften it. Just acceptance settling in, the same way the ground had been settling all afternoon. "Understood," she said quietly. He gave a final nod and turned back toward the trucks, already moving on to the next phase of work, because for him, this was one situation in a long line of situations that all followed the same rules. The difference was never the outcome. It was how people got there. I took one last look at the slope. The movement had slowed to almost nothing now, just the faintest shift, the last pieces finding their place. The water still flowed, but it was guided now, redirected into paths that made sense. Temporary solutions holding until something permanent could take over. I could almost see the outline of what would come next. Engineers. Surveys. New designs. A wall rebuilt not because it looked good, but because it was required. Because the land had already made that decision a long time ago. Victoria stepped closer one last time, stopping beside me but not quite looking at me directly. "This is going to take months," she said. I nodded. "At least." She let out a slow breath, eyes fixed on the hillside. "And it is going to cost more than anything we planned." I did not respond. Right away, I just watched the ground, the water, the quiet system re-establishing itself in a different way. Then I said, "That is usually how it works when you ignore what was already there." She did not argue. There was nothing left to argue with. The slope had said everything it needed to say without raising its voice. The crews kept working. The engineers kept documenting. The neighborhood kept adjusting. And I stood there, exactly where I had been from the start, knowing that nothing I had done created this. I had just followed instructions. Exactly. Completely. By the book. The difference was, I understood what those instructions meant before they were given. And now, so did everyone else. Because the thing they thought they were removing was never just a wall. It was the only thing standing quietly between order and everything that comes after when you take it away.